Second part of Metaphysics of Mind is Physicalism. So we've looked at dualism now, and Physicalism is going to be the other half of this particular topic in philosophy. Physicalism is the view that all of the mind, every part of the mind, and what it means to have a mind, can be explained in terms of physical events and physical descriptions. So in essence, what we're saying here is that mental properties or mental states can be reduced to mere physical properties and physical states. It's kind of the same as saying, well, it just boils down to this thing. So it's like saying the mind, or what goes on in the mind, what the mind is, just boils down to, in essence, electrical activity in the brain at its very core. So that's what physicalism is. There's no such thing as minds, anything other than just physical stuff. So within this topic of physicalism, we're going to be looking at 4 key theories. We've got behaviorism, mind-brain type identity theory, eliminative materialism, and functionalism. So what are the good points about physicalism on the whole? Well, we've seen with dualism that we have this problem of other minds. That is, if the mind is this non-physical thing, this soul-like thing that we cannot see, but all of us have, I can obviously know my mind because I'm just in it, it's mine, I'm conscious myself, so I can be certain of that. But how do I know that you have minds? That was the big problem. Because I can't see them, I can only see the physical stuff going on, physical brains and bodies. So physicalism solves this problem of the minds. Doesn't have that problem anymore because I can just stipulate that you have everything I have because I can see it all. If your mind, if everything you are, your conscious self, is explainable just in physical terms, just in physical descriptions, then I can explain why you have a mind. Because I can just look at your brain and the activities in your brain and explain that that is your mind. Therefore, I have no more problem with the minds, as dualism does. Likewise, there's no more interaction problem, because we're not stipulating that there is some mind substance that's non-physical trying to interact with your physical body. Physicalists are just saying that all you are is physical, and all there is physical properties and physical states, and that's where everything happens. And physicalists or physics can quite easily explain causation on that basis. That is just physical things causing physical things. I like electrical activity. Think of it like a computer. And lastly, another good point of physicalism is it fits with science. It fits with our scientific theories and our scientific doctrine, i.e. the doctrine of materialism, physics, that everything is just physical. And that comes from empiricism, as we should know. So what are the bad points? One bad point is it fails, and you'll see this throughout, so this is going to be a running theme throughout in physicalism. The general problem with physicalism is it fails to properly account for and properly explain qualia, i.e. that what is it like to see colour, what is it like to be a thing. It doesn't explain that because all it's explaining is objective physical appearances of things. It's not really explaining what it's like to be a thing, what it's like to be conscious, to have consciousness. Some might say it doesn't even account for consciousness at all in that way. And the second one is it doesn't account for intentionality. Remembering those terms that we talked about in dualism. Intentionality is that quality of a mental state to be about something in the world. My idea of the moon is about the moon. It's not just a picture of the moon. It has to have this kind of conscious state that is about the thing itself. That's what a mental state does. Unlike, say, ChatGPT, could write a very elegant, beautiful essay. Seems to know a lot about a lot of things. Maybe used in teaching. But does it know what it's talking about? Does it require a mind? Well, one argument is that it does require this conscious mind in order for a thing to know what it's actually talking about. And therefore computers don't have that, even though they're just physical. They don't have the minds in that kind of way of being able to know what it's talking about. To be able to connect the thing, the mental state, with the actual object in the world. So starting with behaviourism then, we've got Hempel's hard behaviourism. Remember Hempel and hard, H and H, Hempel's hard behaviourism. That states that mental states are analytically reducible to mere behaviours. So behaviour is just to say that, look, well, what is a mental state? They want to come away from talk of this kind of thing that we have, this conscious substancy type thing, or whatever, conscious property, whatever you want to talk about as a thing separate from the physical. Physicalists don't want to talk about that thing. So behaviourists will just reduce mental states like pain and desires and all those things to mere behaviours. It's an analytic reduction because it's making a reduction from the meaning of the term pain to just a behavioural state. So analytical reduction is reducing the meaning of the terms to something, i.e. behaviours. So that's kind of how this looks. Pain is just some behaviour or maybe even set of behaviours. Now, one problem with this, the first problem with behaviourism is the issue of multiple realisability. It's the first kind of obvious problem. And what the issue is whatever behaviour you want to talk about, let's talk about laughing, say. So we can laugh, that's a behaviour. So laughing should be then accounted for in a mental, or mental states like should be accounted for in terms of behaviours. So when I laugh, that has to be reduced to some kind of mental state. Well, it seems like laughing can be reduced to or accounted for in many different types of mental states, multiple mental states. We've got because you find things funny, that's a mental state it seems. Because you find things awkward, well that's quite a different mental state. Or because you find something sad or whatever. There's lots of different mental states that you seem to be able to be in when you're doing one behaviour, which is laughing. So it seems like difficulty to account for, well, what is laughing if it's just one mental state or multiple mental states? Conversely, think about one mental state, pain. Think about how many different behaviours you can instantiate when you're in pain, when you're in the mental state of pain. This is multiple realisability. It seems like with behaviourism, they don't really give a strict account of what behaviours equal what mental states. If there was an analytic reduction between a mental state and a behaviour, then for any one behaviour that shouldn't be able to be counted for in multiple different types of mental states. So that's the first issue here, is multiple realisability. The second issue is circularity. We've talked about circular arguments before, or begging the question. It's when you're trying to prove one thing in terms of another and then trying to prove that thing in terms of the thing you've just tried to prove. So it kind of goes like this. If you're stating that pain is analytically reducible to behaviour, when I say, well, what is that behaviour? All you're going to have to do then is refer back to pain, the mental state that you're trying to get rid of in the first place. I'm saying, well, why is he laughing? Then you have to say something like, because he finds it funny. You're just making that circular argument in your theory. You're having to refer back to the very thing you were trying to get rid of, which is mental states. That's what circularity is in behaviourism. Big problem. You have to explain away mental states completely. And then we've got even more issues with behaviourism, the perfect actor super Spartan. So this is kind of an obvious one, all right? So if I'm doing things, if I'm behaving in a certain way, how can I, so let's say I'm acting like a mentally ill person or someone with schizophrenia. Let's say I can completely instantiate what it means to be schizophrenic. I can do all the things that a schizophrenic person does. I'm the perfect actor. According to behaviourism, that entails that I am in the mental state of being a schizophrenic person, but I'm just acting. It's the obvious one. Lots of people can just act. Doesn't mean they're in that mental state. So therefore, behaviours don't equal mental states in that way. Equally, we have Putnam's super Spartan example. So what Putnam said here is, imagine a super Spartan, okay? A bit like the Unsullied on Game of Thrones. You can do anything to them, chop the finger off, cut them in any way, hit them, whatever you want to do, you can do to them, and they'll be absolute deadpan, just no expression whatsoever, as if they've not even felt anything. However, inside, they might actually be feeling that pain. They've just been trained to not let on any behaviour, to be absolutely stoic about it, to let those feelings arise but not make any reaction. In that case, according to the behaviourist, that super Spartan isn't in pain, even though internally they're feeling like they're in pain. So therefore, maybe behaviours, or maybe mental states aren't reducible to behaviours because there's something more going on here, it seems. It seems like there's some mismatch between behaviours and mental states, that they can't be one and the same thing. A reply to that from Ryle, I think it was, either Ryle or it might have been Hempel. Hempel's reply was that a more penetrating examination, a more probing examination of what's going on still reveals behaviours, for example, the behaviours of your brain. So for Hempel, he thought, well, you could just look at the way that a brain's behaving or the central nervous system's behaving, and you would know that they're either not schizophrenic or actually in pain at that time. However, maybe that won't do as well, because is there any good evidence that we could ever do that? If you went into a neuroscience lab and they hooked you up onto all these machines, they wouldn't just be able to tell what mental state you're in. At least we can't do that right now. You would have to tell them, and they would have to then map out what's going on. So you have to reveal to them first what mental state you're in before they can even know that the configuration of your brain correlates to that mental state. So this just won't do. So there's your little super Spartan there. Try and remember it by remembering India's little drawing of Paul. So with these issues, we could actually take a turn onto Ryle's soft behaviourism. Ryle makes a little bit of a different adjustment to behaviourism. So he changes it ever so slightly to account for these issues. We call it Ryle's soft behaviourism. So Ryle's soft behaviourism states that mental states are analytically reducible to behavioural dispositions. So instead of behaviours themselves, our outward behaviours, the actual occurrent behaviour, he states that we can reduce it to behavioural dispositions instead. Now, disposition is the way something is configured or inclined to behave given certain environmental inputs or certain circumstances. So that's how he changes it slightly. And this might help us overcome some of those issues with multiple realisability, because behavioural disposition can be realised in different ways. So this explains some of those issues. For example, the super Spartan as well. Maybe it's just that the super Spartan was in a particular behavioural disposition in which he wouldn't react in that way given that pain input. So that's how we can overcome these problems with just saying that mental states are analytically reducible to behaviours themselves. This could be something slightly different. Imagine it like multiple ways your brain could work when it feels pain. So it has multiple types of potentials for how it would behave in a certain circumstance. Now, this is obviously a little bit more vague as a theory, but that's how it accounts for things like multiple realisability. It's not quite as hard, not quite as radical. However, even this has issues. First one is circularity again. It doesn't quite overcome circularity, because when you're explaining what a behavioural disposition is, it seems like you're still going to have to refer back to a mental state in the first place. It's like, well, what is a behavioural disposition X, where you're disposed to react in certain ways? And you say, well, what is that behavioural disposition? You say, it's a disposition of pain. So you're still referring back to those mental states. Another issue, and perhaps a wider issue here, a more important issue, is it seems like we have two ways of assessing what mental states we're in. When I'm looking at you and seeing your mental states, that kind of knowledge is maybe knowledge of your behaviour. If I wanted to know what kind of mental state you're in, usually I would have to assess your behaviour. The gestures you're making, the facial expressions you're pulling, what kind of things you're doing, the propensities you have to do certain things. You might know that someone has the disposition to do X, Y, and Z because you've seen the way that they behave in those circumstances. Whereas self-knowledge seems to be quite different. For me to know that I'm in pain, I don't have to look at myself in the mirror to see how I'm behaving. To know that you're in pain, I have to see something about you to see if you're in pain, some way that you're behaving, some subtle gesture that you're making maybe, or some outward gesture to know that you're in pain. But with me, I don't have to do that. I just have to be in pain. So there is therefore, there's a disparity between knowledge of myself and my own mental states and knowledge of you and your mental states. And if there is that disparity, then it seems like mental states can't always just be reduced to behaviours. Because for myself, I know a mental state without knowing my behaviour. I just have to feel it. Therefore, there must be something that hasn't been explained by behaviourism there. So that's the big problem. Okay, so Smart's mind-brain type identity theory. So with mind-brain type identity theory, the difference here, it's similar on this whole reducible thing, but now what J.J. Smart is saying, he's the proponent of the theory, is that mental state type, say pain, is this time ontologically reducible to brain states or brain state type. An ontological reduction is to say that it is literally that thing. It's not making an analytic reduction, which is saying it means the same thing as this. It's saying in actual reality, that's where it's identified in, just the brain. It's a particular brain state. Ontologically reduction. An ontological reduction is to say that what actually exists, well, it's the brain state that exists rather than the mental state. That's where it's had. So there we go. One issue with the mind-brain type identity theory is the spatial location problem. So it's to ask, where is the mind? And where is the mind if it's in the brain? Okay, it seems like there's an issue there. So when I'm in my mind, seeing everything that's going on here, it seems as though the spatial location of my mental state of what's going on here in the room isn't actually in my brain. If the mind-brain type identity theory, if it's saying it's identical to a brain state, it's ontologically reduced to something happening in the brain, that's where it is, then when I have this mental perception of what's going on here, that doesn't seem like it's in my brain, it seems like it's something outward. Not only that, but if I had a pain in my leg, it seems like that the locus of that mental state is in my leg, not in my brain. So it seems like the mental state itself has some disparity to where it's supposed to be, which is in the brain, as mind-brain type identity theory says. So that's a big issue for them to explain that thing. But here Smart would just say, well, it's a little bit like the masked man fallacy. Just because it seems like it's a certain case doesn't mean it actually, in reality, is that case. Just because for my perception of my pain in my leg, or you guys out there, isn't really in my brain, it doesn't seem like it's located there, it seems like it's located in these areas, doesn't mean that the actual mental state itself isn't located in the brain. But that's a difficult kind of debate to have. It's difficult to take away from the fact that, well, the conscious experience itself seems to be quite different in terms of its spatial location to than just the brain. It's not as if I'm feeling everything that's happening in the brain, it's happening elsewhere. And the second issue is that it's a chauvinistic theory, at least for type identity. So if I plugged us all in and plugged an octopus in and a giraffe in and a gorilla in and lots of different things, right, that surely feel pain, if mental states like pain, one mental state we can all have, and octopuses and giraffes and gorillas and kangaroos and whatever, right, can all have pain, and that is just a brain state type, well, everyone's brain's different. And everyone's configurations are going to be different, but we all have the same pain, but it seems like the way our brains are and the kind of networks that we're going to see and the neural activity we're going to see is going to be different throughout. So therefore, that ontological reduction isn't going to be successful because we're going to have, again, multiple realizability. We're going to have loads of different brain states, which equals one mental state of pain. So it doesn't seem like it's the case that for any mental state type, there's going to be a particular brain state type that is equated to that mental state, because there are so many different brains and brain states in different animals and species and so on. So then there is a revised version of the mind-brain type identity theory, and we call this the mind-brain token identity theory. So we changed this word type from token. So a type, we're all a type of human. The type is just the kind of thing itself, the kind of thing that we all are. And a token of it is every one of us. We're all different, but we're all of the same type. But we're all tokens of that same type of human. But we are obviously all different, but we're still a type of human. That's what token means. The actual one instance of that thing. The one separate instantiation of it. So this is just to say mental states are ontologically reducible to some particular brain state. So any mental state, pain, you can reduce it to some particular brain state or token brain state, which means that for anything like pain that we can talk about, there will be a token brain state amongst all of us that will equal the mental state of pain, and that brain state can be different throughout. So that's how it's been revised. But obviously this becomes a bit weaker because then it's hard to actually identify what pain is if it's going to be different throughout all brains. And it just seems like a very odd thing to say. It seems like you're not really making much of an ontological reduction there, or at least not one that's going to be successfully proved. So even here with token identity theory, we have problems. One problem is the irreducibility of intentionality. So remember, intentionality is that aboutness, okay? That a mental state can be about an object. So if I'm thinking about the moon, I know that my mental state is somehow connected to that thing up there in the sky. It has an aboutness. But if mental states are ontologically reducible to brain states, literally are just brain states, how can a brain state of the moon be about the moon? Because a brain state is basically just like this walnut thing with just different configurations in it, okay? So it's kind of like saying, here's a mental state of a tree, right? And here's a mental state of the moon, okay? We'll say that's the moon. Now the mental state of this tree, according to mind-brain identity theory, is it's sort of like this thing, i.e. a brain state. The mental state of the moon, quite a different thing, is actually just the brain again, but in a different kind of configuration. How does that represent that different to that representing that? Well, these two seem like very similar things, but them two seem like very different things. It seems like there's much more going on with a mental state than it just being a brain state. How can that be about that but not that, and that be about that but not that? It's just a walnutty, fleshy type thing with different electrical signals. So it seems like mind-brain identity theory doesn't really give us much on the intentionality of mental states if it's just reduced to some particular brain state. That's like saying the same thing as how does a computer, which is just the same thing, has all these different electrical signals and it can talk about so many different things in the world, how can all those different configurations of electrical signals be about all those different things in the world without a mind there to interpret that? And the last issue here is evidence from introspection. This is just a simple issue. Introspectively, for me, I can just look into myself and know that my mind is not just a brain. If I didn't know, that I had a brain, let's say I was born into the world and never knew that there were such things as brains, because we never chopped up a skull to see what was inside of it, we would never know that the mind was the brain, because just living as a person, being a conscious person, doesn't self-evidently reveal that it is a brain. We don't even really know what that looks like until we see it. So how do we know that having a mind is just having a brain? It seems like an odd thing. So there you go, those are some issues. Moving on to Churchill's eliminative materialism. They're all kind of similar, but they just have nuanced differences. So Paul and Patricia Churchland, they argued that mental states will just be completely eliminated, which basically means that they're just going to there'll be no more talk of mental states, what they call folk psychology, which is talk of pain and perceptions and desires and beliefs and all those things. They will just be completely eliminated. That folk psychology that we've been doing for all these years successfully will just be completely eradicated when there is a complete neuroscience. What does that even look like? What does that language even look like? Ones and zeros, or T4 and X5 and random letters and wordings, and who knows what that'll look like. But that's what they think will happen. mental states will just be eliminated, eradicated and replaced by completed neuroscience. No such thing as pain anymore. There is just some kind of neuroscientific term for it, some kind of brain taxonomy. Now they want to say completely replaced, not reduced to, just completely eliminated, completely replaced by neuroscience. And for them, one of the reasons they gave is because folk psychology, i.e. the way that we talk about minds at the minute, is a degenerating theory that doesn't help us anymore. It's stagnant. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't help us explain all of these wild phenomena of being human and the ways we behave and why we sleep and what imagination is and all those things. And I think because that's the case, we'll have to eradicate it for something more sophisticated, i.e. neuroscience, whatever that means. But an issue here, or an argument against the Churchlands, is to say, well, folk psychology is actually a pretty good theory. It's actually a good theory. It helps us predict things quite well. By me just talking about your beliefs and your desires, I can probably predict what you will do quite well, or at least explain why you've done something. This person seemed to really desire coffee. They kept talking about how much they wanted coffee. They expressed their desires for coffee, talking about a mental state. They also knew that there was some coffee around the corner. And that explains quite well why they've now got up and gone out the room to go and get some coffee. There you go. Pretty good theory. Works quite well. Simplistic, I know, but it does its job. The Churchlands would return on that and say that just because we think it's a good theory, just because it works for us at a particular time, doesn't mean that it's actually true or actually talks about anything real. Won't go into detail on that, but it's pretty ridiculous because it does work quite well. Okay. Issue number 2 is that the theory is self-defeating. Okay. So Paul and Patricia Churchland, right? They ask us to completely eradicate talk of beliefs and desires. It's not even a thing. It's going to be completely replaced because it's actually just radically false to talk about beliefs and desires, right, and mental states. So let's say that's true. Then they've just made a self-defeating theory. Because what does that mean? If there's no such thing as beliefs, right? I don't have any more beliefs. That means their very theory that they've spent all this time working on cannot be believed. It's pretty pointless to have then, isn't it? If I can't believe anything, because we have to eradicate beliefs, then I can't believe their theory. Therefore, we ought not to accept it. Self-defeating theory. They do have a reply for that. You can have a look into that if you like. I'm not going to waste my time on it. So Putnam's Functionalism is our last one. Okay, so Putnam's Functionalism, our last physicalist theory that we're going to quickly brief over for this topic. So in essence, what Putnam is saying here is mental states are reducible to functional roles. So this one is to say, like all physicalist theories, we need to get rid of this idea of mental states being this separate thing to just like the brain or the physical body. Now with functionalism, they're saying that we have to think of mental states rather not as a thing, but rather as a function, what it does, the way its input and output, what it's trying to do. Okay, that's what a mental state is. Rather than it being a thing, it's more of just a function, a doing, a causal relationship. Pain then is more of something that is a process. It's a process from the input being where the pain started to some output being something like behaviour with a whole lot of variables within that. Slightly more sophisticated behaviourism. So what functionalism is saying here is you are sort of like a computer. So anything that functions in a particular way, like we do, can have a mental state because they're reducing mental states to functional roles. So if a computer can function like we do, talk like we do, like a robot, etc., then they have mental states like we do according to functionalism because they have the same functional role and they're reducing mental states to functional roles. So in essence, it works like this. You get a pain, you get hit on the knee. The input is the senses of, so the sensory data from you getting hit on the knee. to all of these variables in this computational model of what's going on in the neurons in your brain to some sort of output. That's all a mental state is, input to output. This is the connectionist computational model, which was devised in the late 20th century, and this kind of explains how an input can go through a variety of different nodes, which are the variables, which will give us a certain output. So it's quite a sophisticated model of the mind, at least more sophisticated than the other theories so far. So that's how it works. Issues here. The first one is what we call the inverted spectrum problem. So it's worth knowing. It's to do with qualia. So let's say it's true that a mental state is just a functional role. It's just an input with a certain complex variables of neural activity to some kind of output, i.e. behaviour or something, or perception. What about the possibility of inverted qualia? Inverted qualia is the possibility that when you're looking at green and I'm looking at green, or when I'm looking at red and you're looking at red, of course we call that thing red. And we can all have the same output, i.e. when we all talk about red, the same equivalent output of pointing out all the red things. However, just because we can point out all the red things when we talk about red, doesn't mean that it's not impossible that when you're seeing red and I'm seeing red, in fact, I'm seeing your green and you're seeing my red. Okay? Or when you're seeing red, I'm seeing your green, and when you're seeing green, I'm seeing your red. So that's the idea of inverted qualia. It's possible that actually we're seeing different qualia when we're looking at the same thing, but at least we can function in the same way because we still all call that thing red, and we still can all have that equivalent output of pointing out all the red things, even though what it actually looks like to each of us could be different. And we can never know, because we can never jump into each other's heads and jump into each other's conscious minds to find out whether your red is my red, whether my green is your green. So another big issue here is the functional duplicates with no qualia. So again, this is actually quite a big issue. And it comes down to Bloch's China brain thought experiment, Ned Bloch's China brain thought experiment. Now the thought experiment goes like this, okay? If mental states are just reducible to functional roles, i.e. inputs and outputs, and if we have equivalent functional roles, then we have the same mental states. So let's say we hook up all of China, right? And they're hooked up, right, to this like communication system, just like neurons in your brain, say. And for every time one Chinese person gets called, they've just got to take some instructions and dial, and then another Chinese person's called. And they just do this throughout all of China, say. This is Ned Bloch's thought experiment, by the way, not mine. And there is this particular input, and it can be the same input that we get, say, each individual. And then that input has the same output, say. So it's got functional duplicates that have the same functional role, the whole of China and then me, myself, from the input to the output. Does that mean, or it could be like a conversation, say, does that mean that if we have the same functional roles, so my input and output is the same as the whole of China's input and output for whatever that thing is, does that mean that the whole of China has a mental state, was conscious like I was of what was going on? That's the thought experiment, of which it kind of pumps that intuition that no, the whole of China, even if it's functionally duplicate to you in terms of input and output, whatever that thing is, wouldn't be having a mental state like you, i.e. that conscious experience of that thing, what's going on. Equally, we could argue the same for a computer. If there was a robot that could instantiate all of my behaviours, talk like me, walk like me, all those things, and have a conversation like me, just by some really complex computational system, does that mean that it's conscious like me as well? Does that mean it really has the qualia that I've got? Potentially not. That's the problem here with functionalism, and that's up to you to decide what you think and how you would, what your intuition